is wonderful, wonderful to be here with you all today, and we have an incredible group of people. To start with, Antonella, if you just want to start, please.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Hassan, for inviting me to this roundtable. And thanks also to Tacit Commons. So I am Antonella Diana, and I am an anthropologist, sociocultural anthropologist by training. And my area of expertise is ethnicity, border governance, urbanization, amongst other topics in the region between southwestern China and mainland Southeast Asia. So my geographic research focus has been for a long time this part of China and Southeast Asia. I was trained initially as a sinologist in Italy, and then I did my master's and postgraduate studies in Australia at the Australian National University. I'm currently based at the University of Ca' Foscari in Venice, Italy. I just finished a Marie Curie project on urbanization in southwestern China. And I'm actually in the phase of leaving the academy, maybe for good. I think explained, articulated some of the reasons in a podcast that I had with Hassan last week. I'm feeling like I need to be re-enchanted, and I realized that over the last few years, academia hasn't been really able to re-enchant me much. So maybe it's just going to be a break and need to re-enchant myself outside of academia. But anyway, nevertheless, I'm really happy to be with you guys to discuss this topic.
Well, on the issue of re-enchantment, right, of course, you know as well, if not better than I do, that nature plays a fundamental role in all of this, right?
Yeah, and actually one of the topics I wanted to raise in this conversation was the whole, like I listened to a podcast by Bentley Art last week or a few weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, where he was talking about nature. The name of
Bentley Hart?
David Bentley Art, and the talk was actually entitled Satchit Ananda. So it was explaining these, three concepts in Indian philosophy, but then it was translating them in the way we perceive of, being and consciousness, and also the concept of nature. And the way I see our relationship with the environment and also with climate change, or what is called climate change. I mean, later I want to also bring up the issue of, are we assuming that are we taking for granted the whole concept of climate change? First, this was one of the first topics I wanted to raise. Like, are we taking this for granted? Are we taking this as an assumption? Or we need to actually even question this as a start, from the beginning of this talk. And then also the idea of nature. So David says in his talk, we have not direct access to nature as such. We can only access nature through the interval of the supernatural. This is what he says. And so my talking about enchantment, I was thinking, so does it mean that maybe we go to the point of spoiling the planet, to this degree, because we've lost touch with nature, and therefore the way to somehow restore some level of balance and harmony in the planet, would it be to actually reconnect with the supernatural? So these are some of the thoughts that I'd like to bring to this conversation, and I'd like to hear from you guys. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. I really like that. I mean, what are the assumptions, the sort of foundational assumptions that we bring to the table in order to even have a conversation, right? The assumption is, with the title, that climate change, as the sort of mainstream narrative has it, is a reality. Now,
Yeah.
before listeners, claim that either myself or Antonella or what have you are climate change deniers, right? Conspiracy, like on a very, very basic level, right? It very much bears pointing out that in this kind of broader narrative, I just saw a BBC News sort of story on in 2 months. I think it's 2 months old, where the Vatican, Pope Francis invited world leaders to speak to the issue of climate change. They signed this document, and the COP summit, and to take this thing. It was all kind of nicely staged and all of that. And I say nicely staged because in the whole discussion, I don't see it being mentioned the major players in all of this, which are the corporations. Like, we everyday individuals have to change our ways. We have to rectify. We have to change our light bulbs, right? A la Gore and things like that. But is that really going to change? So problematizing the very sort of narrative. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, what I'd like to suggest is, okay, there is a discourse of climate change, and I mean, we all read Foucault, right? So I don't think discourses that never come into being without having some, a certain power groups, bringing.
Fundamental to any knowledge production is the element of power, right? Power/knowledge.
That's it. So this is what I like to start from, if you guys agree, in the sense, okay, are we going to problematize the whole idea of climate change,
right?
As as a discourse, first of all, and then move on.
And then how do we engage with nature? Again, this is a very, very important point, that nature as a sort of concept has a certain historic provenance, right? It is a modern invention. And now we see ourselves, I mean, historically it was cast as man and nature, man versus nature, or the human being, versus nature, or woman versus nature. But are we so inseparable, or what are the access points? I mean, to sort of echo some things you brought up already, is it through the supernatural? I mean, anyway, we'll come to beautiful sort of points to start on, and then moving to David.
Hi, I'm David Armstrong. It's nice to meet Antonella, Yuan Mei, and Adelaide. So just for anyone who doesn't know, my graduate background is in religious studies and classics, with an emphasis on Bible, early Judaism, and early Christianity. I run a Substack newsletter and a YouTube channel, A Perennial Digression, where I do work in comparative religion and theology and various other things. And I was excited to take up this conversation when Hassan asked me to today, because climate change is a thing that's on my mind a lot now that I'm a new dad. The state of the natural world, what humans are doing to it, and especially how religion can be a useful resource for making sense of what is going on, and for sort of guiding us into better cultural and civilizational practices, is something I'm thinking a lot more about now that it's not just me, One thing that came to mind when Hassan pitched this idea to me is that climate change itself is not new. The way that humans are impacting the environment right now is new because of increased globalization, increased industry, the ways that politics and economics are sort of reinforcing each other. All of that is fairly new. But what isn't new, it seems to me, is that the climate has changed before. And this has impacted human evolution, human civilization, and human history in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways that I think is really striking is that religious texts remember and respond to certain events related to climate change, and they can maybe provide resources for making sense of what to look for, what to be on the lookout for, and how to assess these things. So one example, before I kind of turn it over, at the end of Genesis, Joseph has sort of become Pharaoh's right-hand man in Egypt. He is the viceroy, which was a very common political position in the ancient Near East. And a famine breaks out in the Near East, in Canaan and the Levant. This was incredibly common. Scholars hypothesize that 3 out of every 10 years resulted in crop failure for people living in Canaan in antiquity. And what the text tells us also seems to reflect what we know about what would happen in situations of famine. There would be mass migration to wherever had food. And so in this particular case, Joseph is already in Egypt. Jacob, his father, and Joseph's brothers head down to Egypt. But at the same time that they're doing this, that they are sort of moving into Egypt and taking up residence there, Joseph is engaging in a campaign of basically buying everything. So Joseph, the people come to Joseph and ask for access to Pharaoh's grain reserves. And basically when they run out of money, they say, take our land and our livestock. And when they run out of land and livestock, they say, take us, enslave us to Pharaoh, just feed us, keep us alive. And Joseph agrees to this. And in a sense, Joseph's placement affords a place for his family. And in the traditional narrative of the Torah, this is what enables them to grow numerous in Egypt. And of course, that will later backfire for them. But one thing that strikes me about this particular story when it comes to climate change is that in response to climate change, people had to adopt economic and political practices that were not ideal, that were hierarchically based, that were not equal. And this ended up leading people into positions of multi-generational vulnerability. And so I think one way that religion can chart out a collective future in a world that's defined by environmental change and crises of various interrelated kinds that it's true require a significant degree of personal and institutional and societal change is to remind us of ways this has happened in the past, so that we do not have to repeat certain habits that have been with us for a long time, right? Whether there was a real Jacob, whether there was a real Joseph, the story thinks at least that it's talking about like 2000 BCE, right? This is a series of trends that is not new. The new question is, how do we respond to the magnitude of what's going on now, and how do we do so in a way that is more collectively, in terms of our collective future, that's more productive and that's more constructive for common life. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome introductory remarks, David. Adelaide? You're sorry, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go. Yes. So I think I had muted you earlier without telling you. So maybe that's what happened. Yeah, okay. Please continue.
Okay, thank you, Hassan. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. My name is Adelaide De Madera. I'm an Italian researcher. I work at the University of Messina at the Department of Law as an associate professor. I teach law and religion and the canon law. So my approach is based on the interconnection, the link between religion and climatic change. I mean, in a broader context, because as legal researchers, we question today which is the role of religion in a modern, democratic, secular or post-secular or desecularized society. So can religion give a contribution to face new issues during this terrible pandemic year? We have studied extensively about this. We have questions where whether religion is part of the problem or part of the solution. And so within this framework, I would like to analyze the position of the Catholic Church. In 2015, Pope Francis enacted a document, a paper, Laudato Si, where he speaks about an ecological conversion. So I mean the position of the Catholic Church, like the position of other mainstream religions, has been subject to an important, a significant evolution, because there has been a transition from an anthropocentric position to a position when there is a strict link, a strict connection between man and nature. So man is not more at the center of everything. And this is, I guess, this is the approach that Pope Francis is following in this important document. But a step forward would be what can be done. I mean, can we, in the near future, can we imagine cooperation between political and religious actors in the pursuit of common goals? Is this a new way of to imagine relationships between churches, I mean church-state relationships? And so we should move, we should make a step forward. I mean, we should not think to a kind of crystallization of church-state relationships. I mean, in Europe, we speak about separation, cooperation, established churches, and every model has its specific features. But at the moment, all these models, I mean, are undergoing a deep crisis. They are not sufficient, they are not enough to face new challenges, to face immigration, religious pluralism, new challenges. So can we imagine in the future new ways of cooperation? I mean, cooperation that should not be founded on the idea of giving extensions to churches, but on the idea of sharing common goals, working together in the pursuit of a more cohesive society, a more sustainable future. This is my point of view. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, there's this sort of discussion, as you mentioned, Adelaide, in Laudato Si and in other sort of theological and theoretical contexts, like not necessarily theological, the need for decentering, our sort of the human perspective, right? Sort of decentering and sort of having a more complex view of things. I mean, Antonella's stroking Vishnu, one of her two cats right now. I mean, we have a deeply intimate relationship with what historically, in recent history, relatively speaking, we call the natural world. But all too often we see things in a sort of hierarchical fashion, or it's anthropocentric and things like that. So how can we rethink our relationships? And of course, people who come, one may say, right, that people who have been thinking for a few years also in terms of a post-colonial perspective, one may say, well, there's sort of let's point to the colonial historicity of a lot of these narratives, right? So non-white peoples have been arguing for some time now that we need to decenter the Eurocentric perspective. So I wonder if some of these correctives are, so they sort of logically follow in some fashion. And I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And Yun Mei?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, a change of paradigm is necessary now, and the key issue is whether religions, even mainstream religions, can give a contribution if form of cooperation can be implemented, and which could be these new channels of communication between different powers, different perspectives can be can be implemented. So if as we know, all religions are powerful resources. I mean, they can influence individual conduct. They can contribute to social changes. They can give a significant contribution to face global environmental changes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll talk more, no doubt. And as far as final introductory remarks, Yun Mei, your turn now. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Hassan, and hello to everyone. It's really nice to meet you face to face, even though in this virtual platform. I'm Yun Mei Wong. I am currently in Kajang, Selangor, Malaysia. I was born in Kuala Lumpur, and then between 2009 and 2014, I was attending a PhD program in Women's Studies in Maryland. That's how I met Hassan. And today I would like to, yes, I'm a feminist researcher.
Although we didn't meet at the Women's Studies program itself, right? But no,
it's in the AAR.
Yeah, we met at the AAR, as I said,
in Baltimore.
American Academy of Religion in Baltimore, right?
Right, yes. So because for me to bring some contribution to this panel, so I would like to introduce the feminist epistemology of situated knowledge. It was written especially by Donna Haraway, initially published in in Feminist Studies in 1988. Situated knowledges, the science question in feminism and the privilege of partial perspective. I'm deeply influenced by this, apparently, because when feminist scholars try to interrogate and understand why conventional knowledge and the mainstream knowledge and all the canon did not and do not include women's voice and perspective. So we need to think about epistemological questions. And one way to create your space is we have to privilege and understand partial perspective equally important for us to understand reality or truth or higher value of humanity. So with that, so whatever I share here, I came from a situated position, not geographically, but gender, race, religion, and all that. Well, and with that, to engage the question of religion is not easy for me because religion is a very complicated issue and reality for me as a person and as an academic topic. So I need to give you a context of Malaysia. Malaysia was colonized by the British, and then in 1957 gained independency, and then we born with the federal constitutions, and this federal constitution is supposed to be the superior legal document for a nation state, And within this document, Article 3.1 of the Federal Constitution recognized Islam as the religion of the Federation. But it also says Islam is the religion of the Federation, but other religion may be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the Federation. So again, with this legal clause, it opened up to different interpretation. So one interpretation is this constitution was established in the spirit of secularism, in the sense that multicultural can be practiced within the Christian tradition, when Orthodox, Protestantism allowed to exist together with Catholicism, and that secularism, multi-religion. And in 1957, when Islam was elevated as the religion of the Federation, the time, in terms of population of the nation state, between 60 to 65% actually were non-Muslim. It was because during colonial time, it's a very migrant society. But if you look at the latest statistic, beginning from 2013, and this is 2021, about 60% of the population are Muslims. Do you see the transition from there and then? Now, for COSM in 1957 was 65% non-Muslim, but then the figure also dropped in 1963 when Singapore was actually expelled from Malaysia. Singapore was part of Malaysia.
I'm going to pause you ever so briefly, if you don't mind. So I just wanted, all of us to have some initial introductory remarks, like if we can, so stuff we can then build on, and then we're going to have occasion to talk more and more. So just some key points, like, so which we get. I think, you're coming, you understand this from a situated sort of knowledge perspective, feminist epistemology. Donna Haraway has played a very significant role as far as shaping your understanding of things. So I apologize for interrupting, but I was hoping to have an initial and introductory sort of thing, and then we're going to build on it. Now, that being done, having interrupted you, I apologize. Antonella, could we come back to you? Did you have some responses to some of the suggestions thus made, or would you like to build on some of the things that you've said already? Because if I may also mention, and you're on mute, but you you've already mentioned, if you can unmute yourself as well, please. You've also mentioned today, but I also know that you have a very interesting educational background, and I was hoping you could also speak maybe a little bit to Antonella, if you're interested, the role that China. You're a sinologist and you studied China extensively, lived there, etc., etc. Is a major player in this sort of phenomenon known as climate change. At the very least, as far as global, this is what the stats are showing, global carbon dioxide emissions, China's a very big player. I wonder if you wanted to speak a little bit to that. My knowledge of China is very minimal, and only comes through through my news feed on Facebook, the different articles that crop up, and China is this kind of demonic force in the world, apparently. I don't know how true that is, but you're on mute still, Anto.
Well, there is a global agenda on climate change. The discourse of climate change is global, and China has joined this discourse. And of course, it's joined the discourse by speaking a certain language in an international arena, and then speaking another language, in the domestic arena, right? I was in China for the last time in 2019, and in kind of a very small town / almost countryside area in southwestern China, and even farmers were talking about concepts of, Shanghai in Chinese, this kind of, looking after the environment and, produce less pollution, and which of course in many ways reflected, the TV has a huge role in China in shaping people's, ideas about certain processes and policies. And so the discourse was really going from, the leaders. When I was doing my research on urbanization, I went to interview people from the urban planning office and the vice mayor of the city. And they would all bring up, the topic of, we need to build more kind of livable cities. This is, this new concept of livable cities with less pollution. But in the end, if you observe then, like what's really happening in reality, I could see there is a gap between the discourse that is being somehow, formulated by the government and what is really happening on the ground. Because China still emphasizing the need, to rise, to raise the GDP, and at the same time they're also talking about, we have to do it, but in a way that we produce less, carbon emissions. And but in real life, people are not really, I don't think they're really understanding what that means, like how this should be translated, in practical terms, other than, regulating certain patterns and of consumption. Or I could see, speaking of religion, how the Theravada Buddhism, Buddhist Sangha in this area, because it's the area where I worked is people by ethnic dye. And so the main religion is Theravada Buddhism, and the Sangha, the local Sangha, was playing an important role in kind of transmitting these ideas of, by looking after the environment, protecting the environment, but nevertheless, they were somehow filtered, and transmitted by the government, the Chinese government. So somehow the Buddhist Sangha was acting as an arm of the government to reach out, to the Dai believers, the Buddhist believers in the area.
And also the role of Confucianism, right? Although Confucianism is typically not seen as a religion per se, but the idea at the very least, in sort of, from what I understand amongst the Chinese, right? The understanding through Confucianism as a result of Confucian notions of statecraft and the roles that the state plays. So there's almost from what I understand, you can correct me, please, the almost natural, to use that problematic term, acceptance of paternalistic oversight. An example that comes to mind, I think I mentioned this in another podcast, but it's a recent sort of news report that in China, they've banned now the playing of video games for school children between Mondays and Fridays or something like that. So this type of thing, I don't know if you wanted to speak to the influence of Confucianism in this regard as well.
Confucianism doesn't play a role in very obvious terms, but the government draws on strategically on certain Confucian ideas, this whole concept of harmony that is being in the old Chinese political discourse over the last 15 years. 和谐, everything nice about, so in the beginning was applied to society. We need to build a harmonious society, okay? 和谐社会. So, all the policies that follow well directed towards building harmonious society. Then they apply it to other issues, and now they're even applying this idea, this Confucianist idea of 和谐 to the environment. This traces back to, the former Chinese leader before, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is just, kind of incorporating former kind of discourses to give some kind of continuity to the current reality. But in terms of, if you refer to Confucianism in the way, people in China are kind of tend to follow somehow, the hierarchy, and of course, whatever comes from above. Yeah, we could talk in these terms, but otherwise, the way Confucianist discourse is used to actually convey certain ideas or apply certain policies is done in very strategic terms. And sometimes, in very creative, I would say, even. I mean, they just, pick the concept of the word, the key word, and then they create a whole discourse around, a new discourse around this keyword, right? But then, the genealogy is Confucianism, right? Because Confucianism gives legitimation to whatever, is done and is put into practice right now. So Confucianism gives legitimation to policies, I would say.
That's fascinating. I mean, the fundamental role, I mean, you're kind of really continuing in many ways, you're building upon your introductory remarks about the sort of Foucauldian analysis of how discourse, right? It's a sort of Foucauldian term, not in sort of the way we understand in everyday speech, but the power and knowledge have this inseparable role, and the two can really, it's very hard to disentangle the two. So statecraft, in so many words, right, is necessarily dependent on however statecraft manifests itself. And, there's no denying the fact that states, modern nation states, in order for them to function, if they're not failed states, they have very well thought out manners in which the state is run and people are controlled and sort of enabled as well. I mean, but to continue along those lines a little bit, to come back to David, and your sort of opening remarks, what occurred to me in sort of in relation to also some of Antonella's points was, you mentioned some of these biblical stories, and fascinating insight on your part is a point the point that bears repeating is the nature of a lot of these religious texts, not least the Bible. This is also true for the Quran, one may say, and other texts. These are historic documents. These are documents that have not been created in some sort of vacuum, right? In order for them to make sense to people, and this is how myths work, mythology works, right? It has to reference things that people somehow have some historic memory of, whether imagined or otherwise. And memory is a funny thing. But regardless, I'm not sort of commenting necessarily on the objective nature of these stories or not. I mean, myth is something deeper than that. I mean, we're so obsessed with our sort of modern scientific minds to identify what is objectively true versus what is not. But is it objectively true that we're actually having a conversation? One could say yes and no, right? Because anyway, not to go on and on about that. But on the question of statecraft, I can't help but feel that I can't help but recall Lewis Mumford. I mentioned this example, actually, podcast I did yesterday with Saad on the topic of religion and the metaverse. Lewis Mumford, the great sociologist, historian, incredibly influential in his own day, who's now latterly been forgotten in his own time, is very, very influential. He identifies the story of Moses versus Pharaoh as being the archetypal story which encapsulates this sort of eternal, as it were, timeless, perennial battle, struggle between people in power, right, the state, as it were, and sort of everyday people, and Moses being, Pharaoh being that, and Moses being the everyday person. So I wonder, what role do you think in even these stories that come down to us through the Bible? Like, we know in the history, in British colonial history, right, famines were literally manufactured. The British in Calcutta, they literally manufactured famines, where in pre-colonial times, famines would happen every so many, like hundreds of years. And then under the British, like they had a spate of famines which wiped out significant chunks of the population. So I wonder if you want to comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. So first, to your point about history. So you and Yuenmei were AAR people. I'm an SBL person. So for those unfamiliar with the craft, the Academy or the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature often sort of have parallel conferences with one another. And there are running jokes about, being an SBL guy or being an AAR guy. Sorry, that's Daisy, my most direct connection to the environment right here beside me, wanting more attention. Now, yes, to your point about history, I care a lot less about whether there was a real Jacob than I do about whether there was a real Jesus, partially because, the data is just very different when you're trying to do historical work on the Gospels versus when you're trying to do historical work on the Torah. What I think is actually more useful if I'm reading something like the stories of the patriarchs or when I'm reading something like the Exodus is to reflect. I mean, the historical questions are interesting, right? Like, is there some kind of historical kernel of truth to the Exodus? I tend to agree with Richard Elliott Friedman that probably the escapees are just the Levites, and they basically join up with Israel and Canaan and sort of give them their national origin story. But that's a less interesting question than the dynamics that are at play, right? So one of the things that you notice when you read biblical literature is that there is a shift from agrarian society to hierarchical society in the period of the judges to the monarchy. And that in the wake of the exile, kind of the big challenge for the exilic and post-exilic returnees is how do we want to reorganize ourselves under foreign rule in the land? And there are going to be continuities and discontinuities there. And by the time that you get to the New Testament, it's interesting. You're actually moving from largely agrarian societies to largely urban ones. In not only the Near East, but in the Greco-Roman world and the Mediterranean. And what's interesting about that is that, especially in the period of early Judaism and the period in which early Christianity emerges, we start getting this genre of apocalypticism, right? And apocalypticism sort of wears a lot of hats. On the one hand, it's visionary literature. On the other hand, it is sort of prophecy in a new mode influenced by sapiential wisdom texts. On the other hand, it's also political commentary. If you read the book of Daniel and you don't see that the horrible monsters that Daniel sees in his visions are human empires that basically have chaos creatures that represent them in the heavenly court, you're not reading it correctly. If you read, the Apocalypse of John and you don't realize that the monsters who are coming up out of the sea and the earth are the Roman Empire and the imperial cults, and that a big theme for the Apocalypse of John, John says at one point, the time has come to destroy those who destroy the earth, right? Because the Roman Empire, really bad for the environment in all kinds of ways, responsible for the extinction of tons of wildlife species to fund their, sporting practices, would literally just change whole landscapes to facilitate, military movement, often impose sort of requirements on different agrarian areas in their provinces that end up ruining arable land. There's a whole study you could do on Roman climate change.
Not much has changed, right? I mean, it's like same old, right? Some may say that the reason why these stories have this kind of archetypal mythological sort of nature to them is they speak to some fundamental, to use that sort of academic diplomat, or essential human qualities, right, of greed and power and these tendencies just they keep playing themselves out throughout human history, right?
So and to kind of put a bow on that and sort of summarize what I'm saying in response to your question. I mean, so my thesis was on John's Apocalypse. And in the Christian world, there are all kinds of ways to use the apocalypse, right? There are more fundamentalist type people who want to read the apocalypse as, you know, basically a newspaper. And there are people who want to read the apocalypse in purely symbolic ways. I think that the utility of apocalyptic literature and of biblical literature generally is that it records experience. It records experience that people have had with God, that people have had with the world, and it gives us pointers for what to do in our own context. So I think that, you know, if you read the apocalypse and you come away with, wow, the right response to human empires that destroy the earth and abuse peoples is prophetic resistance, like absolutely like disinvest from abusive power structures and long for, right? Like when Rome, aka Babylon in John's Apocalypse, when Rome falls in chapter 18, the response is not sorrow. Heaven celebrates for an entire chapter that God has destroyed, you know, this horrible human empire. And I mean, I'm a universalist, and I think that that's perfectly acceptable language for celebrating the death of evil, you know. And I think in our context, where climate change really is driven, right, where environmental degradation really is driven by imperial interests, kind of all across the board, like my country especially, but other countries too, right? It's worth, like, one of the ways that religion can contribute to a more positive future is to offer this kind of language for making sense of what human institutions are doing to the natural world. You know, whatever kinds of investment we have in that language.
Amazing. Love it. Thanks so much, David. Adelaide, did you have some further thoughts? I mean, whether building on some of the things that have been said or sort of adding to some of the things you started off?
Thank you so much. I liked very much all the presentations about the perspective of the feminist perspective. I mean, I'm not an expert about China. My main question is, I know that China is a country where the management of religious diversity is extremely complex, because there is a high level of state control on religion, and so there is a high risk of discrimination of religious minorities. So I wonder whether in this country is there room for all religious groups to be considered as partners by the state. I mean, because cooperation implies all the actors are considered members, I mean, of a society founded on participation. So when religious actors are not considered on an equal footing, I guess, I mean, I think it could be difficult to speak about dialogue, to develop forms of cooperation with several religious actors. And about the biblical perspective, I would like to say that it's really intriguing to see how religious doctrines, all religious doctrine have been subject to evolution. I mean, religions have always been linked. I mean, there has always been a problem of relationship between churches and the secular governments. And so churches have to face two main challenges. I mean, when we speak about an canonist, an influential canonist, canon law scholar, has spoke about an internal crisis within religion or external crisis. I mean, when there is a clash between religious and secular values, we speak about an external crisis, because religion, a religious denomination or religious group faces a divergence between its own set of values and the set of values of the geographical context where it is rooted. I mean, this is the problem of secularization. But another problem is internal crisis. I mean, whether within within a group there is a divergence. I mean, there could be conservative positions and progressive positions, and so there is an internal crisis because there is not a coherent doctrine. But the very intriguing aspect is that all religions have to, have to face this conundrum. I mean, on one hand, they need to maintain their identity. On the other hand, they need to survive. And so surviving means sometimes negotiation, compromise with external values in order, because a religious group needs people, needs adherents, and when there is a sort of disaffection of the faithful, because the faithful does not internalize religious values, because it does not find, it does not find accommodation to his own needs. As an example, when we speak about the Catholic Church, let's think to the issue of divorced, remarried couples, the exclusion from Eucharist. So the problem of people that feel as excluded from the church. So, I mean, they have to find, all the religions have to find a balance between identity and the need to accommodate the needs of the faithful. And they try to, every religion is subject to evolution. There is a continuous process of evolution of its internal doctrines. And so, cooperation could take advantage of this, the ability of religious, because religion, I guess it's an important, there is a recent sociological study that is extremely interesting. Perhaps after I can share it with you, because they speak about three different dimensions of religion: the individual dimension, the organizational dimension, but also the third dimension is the dimension of the relationship between a faith community and external.
If I may pause you, while you're pulling that up, no, I was going to say, pull that up, please. And I'd like to bring back to Yunmei, because Yunmei, you're bringing, and I genuinely appreciate your thoughts and comments, because Yunmei, you're making us aware of some of these tensions between communities in your very lived practice, in your lived experience in Malaysia. If you could speak to that, and also because you have a very, everyone here today, everyone has a very interesting background, not least of all Yunmei. You have some very lived, apart from the stuff that we're talking about now, but as far as climate change itself, I don't want us to, I want to sort of have that sort of discussion front and center as well. As if you could relate some of these experiences.
Yeah,
not Adelaide. Sorry, I meant Yunmei. Yunmei, because you mentioned to me a farmer that you've been engaging with and you have extensive experience with, and some of his pronouncements. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but please, Well, when I cut you off earlier, I apologize, Yunmei, for cutting you off. Please continue what you're saying, but also I want you to mention the story about the farmer, which is a profound insight. Yunmei, not Adelaide, sorry, Yunmei.
No,
Yunmei,
no.
unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Adelaide, for your sharing. I really appreciate the point about how religion is being positioned in a society. And here, I want to speak to David's point about biblical versus religious discourse, and what about practice of religion. So I take, for example, the religion of Christianity is also a huge influence in Malaysia and very important to the history of colonization. Biblical text, and I'm using a very plain English one. The first book in the Testament, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.
Yunmei, you had some slides, didn't you? Are these slides that, David, you're going to share, or are we on to the slides yet?
Yeah, the slides I will speak to Atinone about urbanization using Malaysia as spectrum. So with this, if this is a biblical text, and within Christianity, if you look at the history of Christianity, there are different phrases, and even now, in different pockets of the world, people are practicing it differently. Yet, religious studies students or scholars or researchers will use humanistics to understand biblical verses. Yet, there is another regime, which is the institution of churches that practice religion, and how do they interpret it? And especially within Christianity, the history, when it opened up the text, liberalized the text, to allow individual interpretation. And this is where I see entrepreneurs also is the agent of religion, agent of Christianity. When they read this verse in plain text, seems like it is right for me to explore and to expand a resource-based economy based on exploitation, utilizations of resources. But then if you are environmentalist as an individual Christian and engage the text, you will see God actually mandated humankind in his image to be the guardian of nature. Right. So why do I say the spirit of secularism, in the sense that you allow people to interpret the text, give equal rights to them and come into negotiation in a democratic way is important, is because we're already in a modern era when individuals, agencies, and institutions are interpreting the text. But yet, if we perpetuate a very hierarchical and very unjust structure, then you cannot let voices who speak against climate, global warming to appear on surface, and so that people can think about it. Actually, there is a religious perspective in economic development. Okay, and then later if the slides I will share later, I will let another person to speak. That is, I want to show the destructions to the country of Malaysia, the nature of Malaysia, actually much intensified in the new nation state, rather than during colonization. Even though Christian missionary will underpin colonizations, like such as a biblical text can be interpreted that way, yet what is more horrendous actually is the current rate of urbanizations and modernization and industrialization that later I will show you.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So when in those latest slides you mentioned the story of the farmer, right? I imagine that's coming up later, because that's a beautiful story. Okay, so David, did you have any responses to everyone thus far?
Yeah, Daisy's.
And by the way, I just want to say in general, sorry to interrupt. Don't feel, please don't feel, any one of you that you have to wait for me to call on you. Like, do feel free to interject and so forth. Like I want this to be as organic an exchange as possible.
Daisy's over here growling, having discovered the doctrine of the Imago Dei. She's like, what the heck, man? I think Yuanmei, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about how, there's the text, and then there's the meaning of the text, right? And then there's the significance of the text. The text itself is a little bit fluid for most of biblical literature. But even if we sort of work with a fixed text, meaning is not fixed, right? Meaning changes over time, over place, depending on who is interpreting the text, why they're interpreting it, what use they have for it. So, if I am reading Genesis 1 as a historian of the text, and I'm trying to understand why did someone write Genesis 1:26 through 28, that humans are made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. What does that mean? Well, if I'm reading it, in a historical context, if I'm reading it against the Enuma Elish, where humans are basically slaves for the gods, right? And the only really divinely imaging human is the Babylonian king, then there's something really profound actually about Genesis 1, where human beings, like the image of God, is being democratized. It's being democratized across to all human beings across gender divisions, right? Across everybody's in the image of God. And so most scholars think that this text is probably written during the exile in Babylon in response to Babylonian mythology. It's paired, of course, with Genesis 2, which is a completely different creation story, Genesis 2:4 through 3:24. Humans are not said to be created in the image of God. They have the divine breath. They're made from the dirt, but they're made from the dirt like the animals that are also made from the dirt, and they're given the task of working the garden, right, and of eating from the trees of the garden. So they're vegetarians. There's no meat eating, right? And kind of the great tragedy of that creation story is, of course, that through an inappropriate arrogation of wisdom, they end up sort of losing this system and they move into an agrarian lifestyle. Now, I think you're right that historically, the Imago Dei gets taken in all kinds of different directions. I think in the Greek fathers, the Imago Dei can be said to have a sort of environmentally positive aspect to it, which is that the church fathers almost singularly read the image of God as signifying human beings as a microcosm. Human beings sort of contain and represent the whole universe, and so the salvation of the human being is really kind of the paradigm for the salvation of the whole world. But the imperial churches, is that how they're reading this? Is that what they do with it? No. I mean, historically we see that, right? Like we see it in the very fact that in the exploration of the New World of North and South America, there had to be an actual conversation in Catholic theology around whether or not Native Americans were human beings, right? There had to be profound protests usually from Spanish missionaries back to the papacy about what servants of the crown were doing to people in the name of the Catholic Church, right? And today, as you point out, I mean, like there are basically two ways to take this story in terms of the environmental impact, right? We can either read the Imago Dei as an excuse to do whatever we want to the natural world, or we can read it as a responsibility, as a position of stewardship. As Adelaide mentioned, Pope Francis's Laudato Si, right? That's clearly the vision that the Vatican now embraces on what the Imago Dei means. So I think like that's sort of an important general comment when we're thinking about religion, climate change in the future, is that we have religious texts. They are not singular in meaning, just by their very nature as texts, right? And we should be open to their omni-significance, but we should also be like very careful about ways they can be read. I mean, this is the utility of like knowing the history of interpretation of something, right? Is that you are not sort of stuck in ways of reading a text that are distinctly unhelpful and that are, you know, the cause of all kinds of evils.
Antonella, I'd love for you to comment. Before you do, I'll just thank you for that, David. And the Islamic sort of understanding, and is open to interpretation, of course. But typically, it's the notion of Khalifatullah, right? Caliph of God. Right? We know that everyone knows, right? Caliphate is this awful, scary word, right? Islamic State, Caliphate, etc., etc. In very clear language, God says, from a Muslim point of view, in the Quranic narrative, when He creates Adam, that and He sort of has this debate with the angels, right? And the angels say to God, they kind of protest and say, "Are you going to create someone who's going to spread mischief in the world, right?" And God says, "I know something that you do not know," right? And so, of course, the angels recognize that human beings have this potential to create mischief and bloodshed and so on and so forth. At the same time, God knows something, you know, in the story that's potentially deeper, which is God creates Adam, who's the archetypal human being, neither male nor female. And Adam's masculinity, traditionally understood, is only a reality in relation to Eve, right? So Hawa, but regardless, Adam represents the archetypal human being, neither male nor female, in a very real sense. And God creates, after creating Adam, God teaches Adam the names of all things, according to the Quranic narrative, and which is, you know, similar to the biblical story. It's understood that the Khalifatullah, which can be translated as God's representative on the earth, God's vice regent. Another, I think, very profound interpretation, translation of that term is pontiff, this old kind of word, pontiff, which literally means like a bridge between heaven and earth. So the role, the ideally realized role of the human being, male and female, right, human beings as such, is to not spread mischief in the world, is to be God's true representative in the earth in enabling the harmonious living of all, right? Or, I mean, alternatively, like we do that job really badly, and what we end up with is all sorts of awfulness. But on your, I mean, to Antonella now, as far as China becoming the global superpower, right? Some may say they already are. It's just, you know, the news outlets have just not caught up with it yet. The waning of the American empire, the waxing of the Chinese new century, like the new caretakers of the world. What are your feelings on some of those things? You don't have to, I mean, you don't have to only address that, but I think it's interesting what's happening right now, to put it mildly.
To be honest, I'm not convinced that China is yet, you know, some say, you know, someone said, and even written that this is the century of China. I'm not sure that this is the case yet. I feel it's still the, you know, we are in the century of America, you know, United States still. You know, the American empire, I think, you know, it's kind of on the waning kind of phase, but I'm not sure that, considering what's actually happening within China, Chinese have a lot to deal, you know, within their country, you know, and they're very good at portraying a certain image of China outside, you know, to the outside world. And, you know, economic growth doesn't really reflect a certain degree of social, you know, social stability within China. And I'm not convinced that, yet China, maybe, it might be, it will be, in the sense that, of course, we see, Chinese investments, all across Africa and Southeast Asia. But I'm not yet, I'm not convinced that this, China is going to be, at the moment,
I don't know if you...
but
yeah.
Going to, replying to Adelaide's point on whether there is any cooperation between religious institutions and the Chinese government. As I said before, all the religious institutions are national institutions. As I said, they are all somehow pervaded by, very secular bodies, in the sense that, whatever happens in those, large meetings of religious, leaders in China, it's all somehow set, whatever topics are addressed are all set by the Chinese government. And those institutions are actually, again, as I said before, really the arms of the Chinese government. So I'm not sure that we can talk about, we can formulate it in terms of cooperation. And also we have to distinguish between, different religious groups in China. I mean, currently we all know what's happening in Xinjiang, and, the relationship between the Chinese government and certain Muslim, groups. There's not much friction, for instance, with the Hui Muslim group, like more in central China, but it's more, with the Xinjiang Uyghurs. And again, it's a different story with Tibetan Buddhists. The Chinese government also has, takes different approaches to dealing with different religious groups, but there are, like all these associations, like at the provincial level, prefectural, provincial, and then the national level. And then all the associations come together under the same umbrella, the government, that is directed by the government. So if any topic on climate change had to be discussed by religious leaders, they will certainly reflect, the official understanding of those topics. This is what I mean. Yeah.
How do you think? I mean, recently there was a news report. Ray Dalio, he's the head of the biggest hedge fund in the world. What's it called? Something Bridgewater. Let me share the article. He commented that. Let me share the article. Here it is. Why billionaire Ray Dalio thinks another economic disaster is coming and how he recommends preparing for it. And in this article, he predicts a potential war happening. Yes, China trade war could get worse between. Yes, so I mean, all these things have implications for the natural world, right? I mean, we speak of trade wars, we speak of economics in very sort of basic terms. It's about mining the earth for all that it's worth.
Yeah, but again, China, on the international arena, the Chinese government states that, they have to tackle carbon emissions, and, they have to tackle the whole climate change issue within the country. And so they try to comply by, the more kind of global discourse on, tackling climate change. But within China, the attitude I see also in entrepreneurs and people, producing goods in, in the Pearl River Delta and, around the Guangdong province, and then in the Shanghai area, the discourse you hear is, well, China is a developing country. In order to to reach, those certain standards that, you Westerners, Westerners have reached, we need, we can't basically respect the standards, the limits you have set. So again, as I said, I think there is a kind of discrepancy between what is told to the outside world and what's happening within China. I mean, at the same time, though, recently over the last, the whole environmentalist discourse in China has been really becoming really like central to the government's, the central government's policies, like in the last 5 years. Now, a lot of literature, even academic literature, is being produced on the whole topic of Shanghai, I say, ecology, environmental protection. They're trying to build, and especially this is being applied to cities. Imagine that China, it's predicted that by 2050, basically 80% of Chinese population will live in cities. And imagine what this means in terms of resources, in terms of, just think about water supply, energy, in terms of also, job. A large portion of the Chinese population is de-agriculturalizing, so shifting to service-based, jobs, or in the eastern part, more of industrial production. But this will have huge impact, on the whole, not only Chinese population itself, but because if all these people we be living in cities, will mean that we'll have like 60%, 50% of Chinese population will be middle class. So where all this middle class Chinese going to get all the resources to live? If they're not even producing like their own vegetables, they're not growing their own food anymore. This will have a huge impact on the rest of the world. And so in a sense, Chinese urbanization is directly linked to the whole discourse, but also the practices on climate change in China. The government is focusing on that because cities will affect, the expansion of cities and urban growth will affect in a way where the way China can actually tackle issues on climate change and respect, comply by what is being said on the international community.
David, I know you have some thoughts on growing food in urban context. Before I want you to speak to that, but before you do, Yunmei, perhaps you can go through your slides first real quick, and then we can go to David and then to Adelaide. Yes.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you. David, would you mind share the screen? There's the, okay, thank you. This is Atanina, what you have mentioned is something very, very important and it's very serious. Right now, we are facing a food security problem, a food crisis, in a sense that because we are losing agricultural land and the generations of knowledge of farming. And this is not only relevant to the nation state of China, where Chinese, come from a very much agricultural civilizations, but it's also happening in Middle East, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So, as on this one, I'm not sure everybody, Adelaide or Atunela, have been to Malaysia, but you're welcome. And when you come here, I live not far from the international airport. And this is the iconic buildings of the capital city. Did I mention that Malaysia only formed in 1963? So looking at this is 2021, is about 17 years ago. It's not long, the history. But this is what the nation state aspire to be, a modern industrialized city. So currently, next slide, if you can see what is going on. David, next slide. From that aspiration, but what currently we are going through, this is already 1 week. We are having a huge flood in Malaysia. So in October 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, released a worrying report on climate change, warning that humanity may have a mere 12 years overall in order to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the time, the world has already warmed up by 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial times. And last year in Malaysia, this year, 2021, we released a report about land surface temperature. A few cities in Malaysia actually have increased more than 4 or 5 degrees Celsius just within the country. Okay, so, and then in terms of flood, in the 2-decade period between 1998 and Malaysia experienced, and 2018, Malaysia experienced 51 natural disasters events with 2 floods recorded alone in 2018. So, and can we go to the next one? So, David, yes. So look at this news. It was published in year 2013, related to the university I went to, Maryland. So Malaysia was ranked 9 in the world in highest rate of forest loss. It lost an estimated 14.4% of its forests and tree cover between 2000 to 2012. And Malaysia had the world's highest rate of forest loss between 2000 and 2012, and data was released in a global forest map developed by a team of researchers from the University of Maryland, Google Inc., NASA, USGS, South Dakota State University, the Woods Hole Research Center, and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Next. So what does it mean to climate change when you lose the forest? Is GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So according to Global Forest Watch, in 2010, Malaysia had 20.3 mega hectare of natural forests, extending over 87% of its land area. But in 2020, it lost 122 kilo hectare of natural forest, equivalent to 85.2 megatons of carbon dioxide emission. Next, please. So let us talk about the urban sprawl. I mean, since when we have urbanization? Urban sprawl in Malaysia actually has its origins in the politics of communist confrontation that began in the 1950s. After the ending of the Japanese occupation of British Malaya, which is part of the Second World War in Asia. So a communist emergency was later declared in Malaysia between 1968 and 1989. But the rapid suburbanization didn't happen in the 50s and 60s, but in the 70s. So I'm speaking from my country point of view and my historical experience to see that even when you have a grand theory, you talk about forest loss, but we can trace it back and ground it in a particular case to look at speak to what Hassan had mentioned, the statecraft contributed to this. So rapid suburbanization actually happened in the 1970s, was primarily the result of and the pursuit of the modern industrialized nation. With the support of the federal government, the Free Trade Zone Act 1971 was gazetted for the orderly development of the industrial parks for export-led. So you can say the neoliberal economy actually started in 1970s, and actually the US was one of the major countries who signed this contract with Malaysia, the Free Trade Zone Act. And following on in 1976, 5 years later, so you see industrial park first developed, and in 1976, then only Malaysia have a Town and Country Planning Act that to control and regulate town and country planning on Peninsular Malaysia at all levels of administrations. So now, what is this picture that I'm showing you? The orange color actually is the land surface temperature, and this result just released this year. So with that urban population that Antonella talked about, so in tandem with Malaysia's rapid economic and urban development, the proportion of urban population increased to 71% in 2010. So 11 years ago in Malaysia, 70% of the population lived in the city. And 2000, it was 62%. And in 2020, the last year, 77.2% of the population lived in the cities. This is based on the statistics from the World Bank. Okay, so what is this thing, the orange color? Beautiful, colorful. And what is this thing called? It's called the urban island effect. Urban island effect is related to the materials that we use to build a city. So these materials that we use to build a city will create a rise of land surface temperature. And and we look at the next one. And okay, sorry. From this study, it shows that the hottest areas would be the industrial areas. And now this actually is a picture of Labuta, City in the Sky. Actually, it was done in 1986 by a Japanese animator, Hayao Miyazaki. It's called the City in the Sky. But I like the image to give us a sense that actually, by right, our Earth and the town supposed to emulate a forest as a forest sponge. This is also recognized by United Nations, that by the forest act as a pumps, through, this is a special term they call evapotranspiration. It's like it will enhance the soil infiltration capacity and moisture retention. Currently, what happened is our concrete city had lost this capacity. That's why we experience floods in a scale that we never expected. So I stop here for this. This is me when I was cleaning an old town nearby my town.
That's incredible. David unfortunately has to leave us because he has family duties. But we will continue and we'll slowly wrap up. So David, did you have some concluding remarks? I know you had some thoughts and insights vis-a-vis urban agriculture and things like that. Would you like to leave us with some of those thoughts, please?
Yeah. Just sort of a last word on that. First of all, thanks for that presentation, Yuan Mei. It was great to watch and to listen to. One thing I would say is that to kind of continue with my theme of talking about biblical literature and the ways that it can speak to climate change concerns, the ways that it can speak to our relationship to the environment, be it wild, agrarian, urban. It's interesting that in the concluding chapters of the Apocalypse, the vision is not necessarily New Eden. It's New Jerusalem that has become Eden effectively. So garden and city have been completely united in this sort of final vision of the ideal human community. At the center of it is the tree of life and the river of the water of life, and there's a good deal of flora and fauna, but it's also a city where people live and where God dwells with people. I think that minimally what that can mean is that religion, and here I'm speaking specifically of the Western Christian tradition out of which I'm operating. Religion can give us visions of an ideal society that unify and harmonize different human life ways as we're coming to junctures in our various societies that require us to kind of rethink how we are doing things, agriculturally speaking, and urban, and in terms of urbanism. So, I think that one thing that religion can and should speak to for our common future, and that I think many major religious traditions are doing, right? Not only Pope Francis, but also His Holiness the Dalai Lama, also His Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, also Thich Nhat Hanh, also whoever, like there are tons of people who are kind of representing major religious communities that are in on this particular stream of discourse right now. I think using religion to advocate for a more harmonious ecology and a more harmonious way of operating human society in conjunction with one another and with the earth is very quickly going to be kind of a baseline for religious credibility in an increasingly secular world. And I also think that we would fail to do a service that we can uniquely offer through failing to transmit religious memories and dreams of what the human relationship to the earth can look like to the conversation. So that's me. It was so nice to meet you all. Talk again.
Thanks so much, David. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And we'll talk soon. Okay, buddy. Take care. So wonderful. Adelaide, did you have any sort of responses to some of the comments thus far? Would you like to continue with some of your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I would like to, as far as I'm concerned, I will give some concluding remarks. I really appreciated a point that you may focus on. She spoke about individual interpretation of the religious message, because sometimes this can be a critical issue. I mean, in hierarchical churches. But I guess, as I said before, all religious traditions are undergoing a process of evolution. From a Catholic, following a Catholic perspective, Pope Francis, in another exhortation, speaks about discernment. So discernment, I mean, so it focuses also on the individual, not only on the on a general doctrine that has to be fine for everyone. And so, and this is an important aspect. The other aspect I would like to underline is that there is a need to construct a new language in religious traditions. As I said, they all religious traditions have inner resources to make their doctrines evolve, taking into consideration the evolution of society. So they can develop religious arguments which underline the importance of environment, of the protection of the nature. And on this point, I would like to underline that Laudato Si is an important change of paradigm. You may speak about the Genesis. Those sentences gave us an idea of human dominion of the nature. And I mean, there is a different language in Laudato Si, because there is a sort of overcoming of this idea of human dominion. And another important aspect is a strict link between environmental crisis and human crisis. So our approach toward the nature, toward the environment, mirrors our approach toward the most frail individuals in society. So there is this correlation that the Pope makes that is extremely interesting. I mean, and so the idea should be to move forward the construction a new language, a language that speaks about environmentalism, refusal of a sort of technological paradigm as human dominion, and an integral ecology. Integral ecology, that means respect for the nature, respect for the environment, but also full development of humanity. So there is also always this strong connection between a change of paradigm concerning environment, but also a complete development of human values, human rights. Yeah, in fact, this is an important aspect, an integral ecology. This is, in this sense, I spoke about the need to build a new language, because the Pope Francis, as all religious leaders, can vehicle a new message, and that has the possibility to influence the faithful, to influence a believer, to promote new ways. Now I'm quoting the European Court of Human Rights, new ways of living together.
That's incredible. Now, as far as awakening, or one may say reawakening, an integral ecology, and an integral way, an integrated way of looking at things. I mean, Antonella, one may say that what is now being done in the Catholic context, bringing out, as it were, the implicit story, is already very explicit, right, in yogic traditions, in Indic traditions, in Buddhist traditions, that it's, I mean, one doesn't have to go very far at all to know everything is connected. And this language, right, is pretty, it's relatively new, one may say, in a Catholic context, right? Maybe a little less new, shall we say, in an Eastern Orthodox context, but it's certainly very old in an Indic context, right? Could you say a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, in fact, I wanted to, my concluding remark would draw on what Adelaide was mentioning, is that we don't necessarily, maybe, especially people who don't identify with any, with a specific institutionalized religion, we might need to also shift the attention back to the individual. Not only, of course, the role of institutions is very important, the role of the state is very important, but we might need to bring also the attention back to the individual and to the way we as individuals can connect with the kind of transcendental realm, and through this connection might really understand that we are really part of, not only of a big community called humanity, but of a larger world that includes animals and plants and minerals and all other beings in this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that advocate not only the role of religion, but the role of spirituality, the role of the connection with another dimension, actually play in us understanding that we need to somehow reverse this process of damaging the planet and nature. And certainly this, as Hassan, you mentioned, was part of the yogic tradition of, you as individual experience, your direct connection with the, with the super consciousness, with our larger, consciousness. And that's how you really realize, where you belong to. I've been talking about this issue with a friend who said, we have stopped traveling because, we're driven to travel, go around the world because we need we need to understand how the world worked, how different people lived by traveling. And I guess now it's time to go within. We are not able to move around the world. I think this is a phase in human history where we need to stay still and go within again. And I think a lot of answers regarding, also climate change in this sense will come, I think, from connecting from within. So this will be my, of course, a very idealistic utopian perspective, but I think as simple as my sound, I think some of the, some answers can come from ourselves and not necessarily, drawing on institutions. Now, myself, I'm kind of having, I don't know if I'm trusting too much what's going on with, state institutions in the way, this pandemic is being, managed and all this. So what I'm trying to do is kind of connect with my inner self and try to find my answers from within, with the current situation. So that's
excellent. Thanks.
Sorry, my cat is eating half of my plant.
Your cat has to be connected to nature at all times. Your cat is a constant reminder that, yeah. And Yunmei, some concluding remarks. And I was just, as you were making those final remarks, Angela, I was sharing a couple of very massive artworks from one of my favorite artists, contemporary certainly, and maybe of all time, Alex Gray, who's, he describes himself as a visionary artist. And he really, as far as I'm concerned, as far as many are concerned, he's tapping into some deeper sort of memories, as it were, sort of deeper communal, mystical memories in sort of presenting to us, reminding us of the fundamental connectedness of all things. And maybe from one perspective, to echo some things you just said, Antonella, maybe it is absolutely necessary, right? Because the community, whether the religious community or at state level or what have you, on a global level, is made up of individuals. And I'm very sort of conscious of the relatively recent provenance of the very notion of the individual as we now understand it, the modern self and things like that. At the same time, this is what we have. This is how we make sense of things, right, for better and for worse. So maybe the change has to come from within on an individual level. And Yunmei?
Okay, my concluding remarks would be, yes, I agree with Adelaide. Environmental crisis is a humanity crisis. It's a humanity crisis. So that's why when David and I picked the Genesis in God's image, actually that verse is very important to understand otherness. It's very important to understand subject and object. So if we see the environment external to us as an object, we're objectifying the environment, saying that it's the problem, but it didn't say actually it's me. This is related to what Antonella shared in the last interview with her. She talked about not everything is constructed. I experience it. Okay, and in feminist term, we have this thing called the embodied knowledge. We embody externality, we embody reality. So we internalize value, we internalize experience. So it's part of us, but yet we used to use objectification to understand problems in the world. So in God's image, we are talking about this significant otherness again. So I'm going to end this with my favorite feminist scholar, Donna Haraway. So related to your cat, her book, When Species Meet. So she asked, Whom do we touch when we touch a dog? How does this touch shape our multi-species world? Multi-species. So this, when we speak back to Genesis, what we saw, and also speak back to, actually currently a lot of people are looking for alternative spirituality, especially from indigenous peoples, indigenous religion, including the Native American. But indeed, actually, indigenous people, the humanity of indigenous people and the humanity of a modern human being shouldn't be seen as one is subject and one is object, and one is the other and one is the center. Indeed, back in all traditions, we have this tradition and we have the text to talk about how to live in a multi-species world and what is the humanity of interconnecting with each other and caring for each other as well as the world. Okay, thank you.
Amazing. That was really amazing. Thank you all so much. This is clearly a topic that is so vast, you know, many hours of discussion and meditation and practice is not going to exhaust this topic. I think these are some introductory, as it were. I mean, people have been writing and thinking about these things for a number of years, many years, but still I can't help but feel that we are at the early stages of trying to think through, or maybe rethink, right? Remember. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you know, what's the sort of, I forget which philosopher said this, but there is nothing new under the sun, right? There's nothing new under the sun. Everything that can be thought, everything that can be said, everything that can be done has already done before in maybe slightly different permutations and combinations. And maybe our task as human beings, in a sort of Platonic sense of making sense of ourselves and the world and everything within it and outside, etc., is to remember some knowledges that we've lost. I think I can't help but feel that the solutions are going to come for all the, you know, for all the problems that we face in the world, all of them, in all the different permutations, combinations, and manifestations. The solutions are going to be present if we engage in a very sophisticated manner with the knowledges that have already come down to us. I don't think we can necessarily think our way out of these problems in a sort of modernistic sense. We have to act and be and become and inspire and serve and become selfless, and seek to, seek to do good in the world, really genuinely seek to do good in the world. And also just conclude on this one Quranic verse that comes to mind, that, you know, Muslims, from a Muslim point of view, God says in the Quran regarding people who kind of argue over the finer points of theology and what have you, that, you know, my religion is right versus your religion is right, and on, right? Those arguments, literally, we've had many millennia of those arguments, whether philosophical, whether metaphysical, whether religious, theological, etc. Clearly, we're not all going to agree on these finer points, right, of theology, philosophy, ideology, on and on, all the E's, all the Y ending words. But then God says, vie with one another in doing good works. Compete with, instead of competing with one another in the realm of ideas and I'm better than you, compete with one another in doing good stuff. I mean, how beautiful, right? Because that's you know, the proof is in the pudding. By their fruits ye shall know them, the biblical verse, you know, God says in the Bible. So it's maybe the proof of the pudding is the proof itself. So if we're doing good stuff, let's unite in doing good stuff. You know, let's agree that there's stuff that needs to be done, there's work that needs to be done, there's charity that needs to be made, there's sort of self-aggrandizements and sort of you know, the first world problems. And, you know, I'm a product of the first world in many ways, not only, but I mean, I have a complex sort of background, but I live in the West, and, you know, I definitely have a huge carbon footprint. Like, I consume, I'm a consumer, right? I'm a massive consumer. So maybe the very least that I can do, maybe this is a start in the right direction, hopefully, is that I can try to speak on behalf of those who maybe don't have the capacity to speak, maybe try to create spaces, in my humble ways, for others to speak, and encourage dialogue, and maybe that's a start, and maybe certainly I think that's a significant part of it. But we also have to act as well, and we have to pray and meditate, and absolutely to Antona's point, we have to really go within in a deep way, in not some superficial, shallow way, like 5 minutes a day, if we're lucky, right? It has to be a lived practice. It's not like a hobby. Like, we have to live and breathe. I mean, for me, I said I'd done on the other point, but this is a related point. I interviewed the brilliant theologian Claudio Carvalhais recently, and I hope to have him on again to speak in particular about this topic that we've addressed today. And we were talking about his most recent book, Ritual at World's End. And he had a very I thought, very beautiful and humbling and practical sort of theological position, that maybe it's not about arguing again and sort of doing necessarily all the, I mean, he made a radical point. So it's not even about trying to, change our light bulbs. It's about engaging in a very deeply felt way with the other, right? With the plant, with the animal, with, I I'm waving my inverted comma fingers around, because we are the other, right? The other is me. And maybe it's, he said something really beautiful, and he's Protestant Christian liberation theologian. And I happened to have studied with him when I was in New York at Uni Theological Seminary. A very beautiful human being, and he has this practice that he's been doing now, where when he sees a tree, when he's walking in the park, he'll bow down before the tree, and not some. I know Claudio, Professor Carvalhais, is a very sincere human being. For him, it's not like lip service; it's real. And so maybe that's the real, to echo, a point that's been coming up a few times today. Maybe that's the real change. Like, it's almost like a mystical engagement. Again, mysticism, mystical. Again, I'm aware of the provenance of these terms, the problematic nature of these terms, but it's like an engagement which isn't theoretical. It's an engagement which is felt, it's lived, it's embodied, right? To echo your points, Yin-Mei, and feminist theologians, and Adelaide's points, about an integrated ecology. The very notion of an integrated ecology is recognizing, really at our root, it's not enough to theoretically talk about this. Again, I'm not saying that that's what you're saying at all, Adelaide, but it's really living and breathing these truths. And maybe, and Professor Carvalhais also mentioned this point when we were talking before, that maybe the changes then just happen naturally. One doesn't have to theoretically say, oh, I have to be nice to my pet. Like, it's just a given, I'm going to be nice to my pet, and onwards and and outwards, right? We treat each living thing like I'm this orchid. Like, maybe I have to recognize it's a living, breathing creature, with whom I share a portion of life and beauty and so forth, and we all do. But thank you all so much, and God bless you all, and thank you for your time, and it's a real pleasure to always to be able to speak to like-minded, like-hearted scholars and thinkers like yourselves, and I look forward to future conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.